You know what I think would be absolutely delightful? Taya said, her voice gaining momentum as the cruel idea crystallized. A little demonstration. After all, if the boy is so fascinated by the game, surely he knows how to play. Rose's face went pale. Mrs. Ashworth, please. Kendrick is just a child. Taya scoffed. I'm quite good at chess myself. I learned from my late husband, who was something of a master. It would be my pleasure to teach the boy a thing or two about knowing one's place. Checkmate, the 12-year-old whispered, his dark eyes meeting hers across 64 squares that had just rewritten everything she thought she knew about the world. Ready for the complete story? Smash that subscribe button and tell me where you are tuning in from in the comments. Tomorrow brings another mind-blowing story that's just as unbelievable. Trust me, you will want to be here for it. Alright, let's jump into it. The crystal chandelier cast rainbow fragments across Taya Ashworth's dining room as she arranged sterling silver spoons with military precision. Each piece had to be perfect, not for the bridge game itself, but for the performance. At 62, Taya had learned that maintaining her position in Charleston's elite required constant vigilance, and today's gathering would be no exception. She paused before the mahogany mirror, adjusting a strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. The reflection showed a woman who had aged beautifully but coldly, her silver hair styled in a way that suggested money rather than warmth. The empty mansion around her echoed with the ghosts of dinner parties from better days, before Robert's death had left her alone with nothing but her pride and her prejudices. Mrs. Ashworth. Rose's voice drifted from the kitchen, soft and respectful as always. The canapes are ready. Leave them on the warming tray, Taya called back, not bothering to look toward the woman who had cleaned her house for 8 years. Rosa Martinez was efficient, quiet, and importantly invisible, exactly what Taya preferred in help. She had no interest in the woman's personal life, her struggles, or the fact that she sometimes brought her son to work during school holidays. 3 floors above, in the small room that served as Rosa's break area, 12-year-old Kendrick West sat cross-legged on a worn cushion, a library book balanced on his knees. The pages were dog-eared from multiple readings, the cover showing chess pieces in mid-battle. His dark eyes moved across the text with the intensity of a scholar, occasionally glancing up to visualize positions on an imaginary board. The room smelled of his mother's cleaning supplies and the faint scent of lemon oil that seemed to permeate everything in the Ashworth mansion. Kendrick had learned to make himself invisible during these visits, understanding instinctively that his presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. He spoke only when spoken to, moved quietly through the halls, and never touched anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. But in this small space, surrounded by chess literature borrowed from the public library, he was free to be himself. His fingers traced the air, working through combinations that would have impressed masters 3 times his age. The Sicilian defense, the Queen's Gambit, the Spanish Opening, each one a gateway to a world where intelligence mattered more than zip codes, where brilliance could overcome any disadvantage. Kendrick Mijo, Rosa's voice carried up the back stairs. Stay quiet today, okay? Mrs. Ashworth has guests coming. Yes, Mama, he whispered back, returning to his book. He'd read this particular chapter on endgame strategies 17 times, but each reading revealed new layers of complexity. Chess wasn't just a game to Kendrick, it was a language he spoke fluently, a realm where he felt truly at home. Below, Taya's doorbell chimed with the arrival of her first guest. Margaret Pemberton swept in wearing enough jewelry to fund a small country, her laugh pitched at the perfect frequency to suggest superiority without appearing vulgar. Taya, darling. I've been absolutely dying to hear about the Thompson wedding. Was it as ghastly as we expected? The familiar ritual began, the exchange of gossip disguised as concern, the subtle competitions over whose grandchildren were most accomplished, whose vacation had been most exotic. Taya played her part perfectly, pouring tea from her grandmother's china while dispensing observations about their social circle with surgical precision. But today felt different. The conversation seemed more hollow, the laughter more forced. Taya found herself glancing toward the kitchen, where she could occasionally glimpse Rosa moving efficiently between tasks. For the first time in years, she wondered about the woman who cleaned her toilets and folded her sheets. Did she have dreams beyond this mansion? Ambitions beyond domestic service? The thought was interrupted by Charlotte Whitmore's arrival, followed by Helen Crawford, each woman armed with fresh gossip and designer handbags. The bridge table was set, the atmosphere thick with a particular tension that came from four women who had known each other too long and liked each other too little. "I do hope you have something interesting planned," Margaret said, arranging her cards with theatrical flair. "These gatherings can be so predictable." Taya's eyes lit up with an idea that would have horrified her better angels, had she possessed any. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see Rosa wiping down counters while Kendrick sat quietly in the corner, still absorbed in his book. "Actually," Taya said slowly, a cruel smile playing at her lips, "I think I have just the entertainment we need." Taya rose from her chair with the grace of a woman who had never doubted her right to command any room she entered. The other women watched with interest as she moved toward the kitchen, her heels clicking against marble with the rhythm of impending mischief. The pieces were in motion, though none of them, not Taya, not her guests, and certainly not the quiet boy with a chess book, could have imagined how dramatically the game was about to change. Kendrick looked up from his reading as four pairs of curious eyes fixed on him through the kitchen doorway, and for the first time in his young life, he was about to discover that being invisible was no longer an option. The silence in the dining room stretched like a taut wire as Taya approached the kitchen doorway, her silk dress rustling with each calculated step. Behind her, three pairs of expectant eyes followed her movement, sensing the approach of entertainment at someone else's expense, the kind of cruel theater that had sustained their social circle for decades. "Rosa," Taya called sweetly, her voice dripping with false warmth that made Kendrick's stomach clench. "Could you come here for a moment? And bring your son?" Rosa's hands froze on the crystal glass she'd been drying. She knew that tone, had heard it directed at other staff, other families, other children who'd made the mistake of existing in Taya Ashworth's peripheral vision. Her protective instincts flared as she glanced at Kendrick, who had gone rigid in his chair, chess book forgotten in his lap. "Mrs. Ashworth." Rosa's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous waters. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's perfect," Taya smiled, though the expression never reached her eyes. "I just thought it might be educational for everyone involved." Margaret Pemberton leaned forward in her chair, jewelry jangling with anticipation. "Taya, darling, what are you plotting? That look in your eyes is positively wicked." "Well," Taya said, her voice gaining strength as she warmed to her cruel inspiration, "I was just thinking how boring our usual bridge game has become. Same cards, same conversations, same predictable outcomes." She paused dramatically, savoring the moment. "But then I noticed something interesting." Kendrick's heart hammered against his ribs as he felt the weight of their attention settling on him like a physical force. The chess book in his hands suddenly felt like evidence of some crime he hadn't known he was committing. "Your boy there," Taya continued, nodding toward Kendrick with a casual dismissiveness she might use to indicate a piece of furniture, "seems quite absorbed in that little book of his." "What is it, dear?" "Coloring pictures." Rosa stepped protectively closer to her son, her voice tight with controlled fear. "It's just a library book, Mrs. Ashworth. Kendrick likes to read while I work." "How industrious," Charlotte Whitmore added, her laugh like glass breaking. "Though I do hope it's age-appropriate material." Taya moved closer, and Kendrick could smell her expensive perfume mixing with the scent of his mother's cleaning supplies, two worlds colliding in a way that made his skin crawl. She reached down and plucked the book from his hands before he could react, her manicured fingers handling it like something distasteful. "The Complete Guide to Chess Strategy," she read aloud, her eyebrows rising in theatrical surprise. My. How ambitious." The ladies erupted in delighted laughter, the sound echoing off the crystal and china like breaking glass. Helen Crawford pressed her hand to her chest in mock amazement. Chess. Can you imagine? How perfectly precious. "I suppose everyone needs dreams," Margaret added with vicious sweetness. "No matter how unrealistic they might be." Kendrick felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Years of making himself invisible had taught him that drawing attention only made things worse. But today, attention had found him anyway. "You know what I think would be absolutely delightful?" Taya said, her voice gaining momentum as the cruel idea crystallized. "A little demonstration. After all, if the boy is so fascinated by the game, surely he knows how to play." Rosa's face went pale. "Mrs. Ashworth, please. Kendrick is just a child. He doesn't need to." "Nonsense." Taya waved away the objection with a jeweled hand. "It's educational. Character building. And besides," she added, her smile turning razor-sharp, "I'm quite good at chess myself. I learned from my late husband, who was something of a master. It would be my pleasure to teach the boy a thing or two about knowing one's place." The cruelty of it hit Kendrick like a physical blow. They wanted to humiliate him, to turn his love of chess into a weapon against him. To prove that boys like him, poor black invisible, had no business dreaming beyond their circumstances. But beneath the fear and humiliation, something else stirred. The same quiet confidence that filled him when he worked through complex combinations in the library, the certainty that came from understanding patterns others couldn't see. I know how to play," Kendrick said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the suddenly silent room. Taya's smile widened like a predator sensing weakness. "Wonderful. Rosa, clear the coffee table in the sitting room. We'll need space for a proper chess set." She turned to her guests with theatrical excitement. "Ladies, I do believe we're about to witness something quite memorable." As Rosa reluctantly moved to prepare the space, her hand shaking slightly as she rearranged magazines and coasters, Taya retrieved her husband's chess set from its place of honor in the study. The pieces were carved from ivory and ebony, each one a work of art that cost more than Rosa made in a month. "Now then," Taya said, setting up the board with ceremonial precision while the other women arranged themselves like spectators at a gladiatorial contest, "let's see what all that library reading has taught you." Kendrick approached the table slowly, his bare feet silent on the Persian rug. The chess set was beautiful, more beautiful than any he'd ever seen, but beauty couldn't mask the ugliness of the situation. They expected him to fail, to fumble, to provide them with the entertainment of his own humiliation. "White or black, dear?" Taya asked with mock courtesy, though her hand was already moving the white pieces toward her side of the board. "Though I suppose in this case, the choice is rather obvious." More laughter from the audience, sharp and cutting. Kendrick took his seat across from Taya, his small hands resting on the edge of the mahogany table. The black pieces stood before him like silent soldiers awaiting orders. "Don't be nervous," Margaret called out cheerfully. "Mrs. Ashworth will go easy on you. Won't you, Taya?" "Oh, I'll be perfectly fair," Taya replied, her fingers dancing across the white queen's crown. "But I do believe in teaching proper lessons. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is help people understand their limitations." The word hung in the air like a curse, and Kendrick felt something shift inside him. All the hours spent studying master games, analyzing positions, dreaming of tournaments and titles, none of that mattered to these women. To them, He would always be just Rosa's boy, the maid's son who didn't know his place. But chess was different. On the 64 squares of this board, wealth and privilege meant nothing. Only understanding mattered. Only truth. "I'm ready," Kendrick said, his voice steadier now, carrying a quiet dignity that made Rosa's heart swell with frightened pride. Taya moved her king's pawn 2 squares forward, e4, the most common opening move in chess. Basic, predictable, the choice of someone who played the game but didn't truly understand it. Kendrick's response was immediate, c5. The Sicilian defense. Aggressive, complex, favored by masters because it created imbalanced positions where superior understanding could triumph over material advantages. The room fell silent except for the soft click of pieces on wood. Taya's confident smile flickered slightly as she studied the position. She'd expected, well, something different. Something more befitting a child playing with pieces beyond his understanding. "Interesting choice," she said carefully, moving her knight to f3. Kendrick responded with d6, continuing the Najor variation, a line so complex that even grandmasters approached it with respect. His moves came without hesitation, each one part of a larger understanding that pulsed through him like music. Margaret leaned forward, her earlier amusement giving way to confusion. "Is he actually playing? I mean really playing?" "Of course he's playing," Taya said sharply, though uncertainty had crept into her voice. "He's just lucky guessing, that's all." But as the game continued, luck began to seem like an inadequate explanation. Kendrick's pieces moved with purpose, creating threats and parrying them with a fluid grace of deep understanding. Each exchange revealed layers of calculation that shouldn't have existed in a 12-year-old boy sitting at his mother's employer's dining table. Taya's confident smile faded entirely as she realized she was no longer teaching a lesson. She was fighting for her chess life against an opponent who saw the board with crystal clarity she'd never possessed. The cruel entertainment she'd planned was transforming into something else entirely, something that would change all of them in ways none of them could have imagined. "Your move, Mrs. Ashworth," Kendrick said quietly, his dark eyes meeting hers across the board for the first time. And in that moment, Taya began to understand that the game had already changed in ways she wasn't prepared for. The ornate sitting room had fallen into an unnatural quiet, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the soft whisper of Kendrick's breathing as he studied the position. What had begun as a circus act was rapidly transforming into something else entirely, something that made the perfectly coiffed ladies shift uncomfortably in their silk-upholstered chairs. Taya stared at the board, her manicured fingers hovering uncertainly over her pieces. The position before her was nothing like what she'd expected to see after a dozen moves against a child. Instead of the chaotic jumble of amateur play, she found herself confronting a structure of elegant complexity that pulsed with hidden threats and sophisticated understanding. Kendrick had just played nf6, developing his knight with quiet precision. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a simple, even obvious move. But Taya's chess education, limited though it was, allowed her to glimpse the deeper currents flowing beneath the surface. The knight supported his central pawn chain while simultaneously preparing to leap to more aggressive squares. Every piece in Kendrick's position seemed to whisper to its companions in a language she was only beginning to recognize. "My goodness," Margaret Pemberton murmured, leaning forward until her diamond necklace caught the light from the chandelier. "How long does it take to move a piece? Surely the boy isn't giving you that much trouble, Taya." But Taya barely heard her. She was lost in the maze of possibilities spreading before her, each variation more complex than the last. Robert had taught her chess during their courtship, gentle games played by the fireplace, more about romance than competition. She'd learned the basic patterns, memorized a few opening sequences, and developed enough skill to hold her own in social games. But this was chess as she'd never encountered it. She finally settled on bc4, developing her bishop with what she hoped was authority. It was a reasonable move, attacking f7, the weakest point in Kendrick's position. Textbook chess. Safe chess. Kendrick's response came without hesitation, e6. The advance supported his center while preparing to develop his dark squared bishop. But it was the speed of his play that unsettled Taya most. No deliberation, no uncertainty, just the fluid confidence of someone who saw the entire game unfolding like a familiar story. How did he move so quickly? Charlotte Whitmore whispered, her voice carrying an edge of confusion that matched Taya's growing unease. Children don't play like that. They pause, they think, they make mistakes. Rosa stood frozen by the window, her dust cloth forgotten in her hands as she watched her son navigate the treacherous waters of her employer's world. She'd known about his chess obsession, of course, the library books, the hours spent staring at positions, the way his eyes would track invisible pieces through the air. But seeing him here, playing with such composure against the woman who held their family's livelihood in her hands, filled her with a mixture of terror and fierce pride. Taya castled kingside, seeking safety for her monarch while trying to project a confidence she no longer felt. The move was sound enough, but it felt reactive rather than purposeful. For the first time in the game, she was following rather than leading. Kendrick's dark eyes swept the board once more before his hand moved to his bishop. b7, developing with perfect timing. The piece found its ideal square, supporting his kingside while maintaining flexibility for future operations. It was a move that spoke of deep understanding, not just of the current position, but of the game's underlying principles. "This is impossible," Helen Crawford muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Where did he learn to play like this? The question hung in the air like an accusation. In their world, talent required proper instruction, expensive coaches, the right social connections. Chess masters were made in exclusive clubs and private schools, not in public libraries and servants' quarters. The idea that genius might flourish in places they'd never thought to look was profoundly unsettling. Taya pushed her queen's pawn forward, d3, trying to control the center and gain some breathing room. But even as she made the move, she could feel it was somehow inadequate. Kendrick's position continued to improve with each exchange, his pieces finding harmony while hers seemed to stumble over each other in their confusion. "Perhaps we should," Margaret began, but her words died as Kendrick moved again. Castle's kingside. The simple move completed his development while tucking his king to safety. But it was more than that, it was a statement. His position was now fully mobilized, every piece contributing to a greater whole that hummed with potential energy. Across from him, Taya's forces looked scattered and purposeless by comparison. The room's atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as cruel theater was becoming something approaching reverence, the kind of hushed attention that accompanied the recognition of something extraordinary. Even the ladies, for all their prejudices and preconceptions, couldn't entirely ignore the evidence unfolding before their eyes. Taya realized with growing horror that she was being outplayed. Not just beaten, but systematically dismantled by an opponent who saw patterns she couldn't even perceive. Each of her moves seemed to play directly into plans she hadn't known existed. It was like fighting shadows, grappling with an intelligence that operated on levels beyond her understanding. She moved her knight to e5, hoping to create some complications, to drag the game into the kind of messy tactical battle where her opponent's youth might finally show. But Kendrick's response, NBD7, simply developing while preparing to challenge her centralized knight, demonstrated once again his profound grasp of positional chess. "Mrs. Ashworth," Kendrick said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade wrapped in silk. "Your knight on e5 is very strong, but it doesn't have any real support. Would you like me to explain why that might become a problem?" The question was asked with genuine innocence, without a trace of mockery or malice. but its implications struck the room like a thunderbolt. A 12-year-old boy, a servant's child, was offering to teach one of Charleston's social elite about the game she'd claimed to master. Margaret's mouth fell open. Charlotte reached for her pearls as if they might anchor her to a world that suddenly made sense. Helen simply stared, her carefully composed features frozen in an expression of bewildered dismay. But it was Taya's reaction that mattered most. The color drained from her face as the full weight of the situation crashed down on her. This wasn't just a chess game anymore. It was an exposure of everything she believed about the world, about herself, about the natural order of things. In offering to explain her position's flaws, Kendrick had inadvertently revealed the Emperor's nakedness for all to see. I don't need. She stammered, then stopped herself. The words died in her throat because they both knew they weren't true. She did need explanation. She needed guidance. She needed help understanding what was happening on the board before her. From a child. From a black child. From the son of her maid. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, filled with the weight of shifting perceptions and crumbling assumptions. Outside, a bird sang in the garden, oblivious to the revolution taking place in Taya Ashworth's sitting room. Rosa watched it all unfold with a mother's heart breaking and soaring simultaneously. Her son, her brilliant, beautiful, impossible son, was revealing himself to people who had never bothered to see him as fully human. But with that revelation came danger. In their world, being exceptional while black was often more curse than blessing. Taya finally moved, pushing a pawn forward almost at random. The move was weak, purposeless, the chess equivalent of flailing in deep water. But Kendrick received it with the same gracious attention he'd shown her stronger efforts, studying the position as if her struggling might yet produce some hidden resource. It wouldn't, and they all knew it. But in that moment of respectful consideration, Kendrick West revealed something even more remarkable than his chess genius, the kind of character that could extend dignity to someone actively trying to humiliate him. The game continued, but everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had already been decided. The only question remaining was how devastating the final revelation would be, and whether any of them would emerge unchanged from witnessing the collision between prejudice and undeniable truth. The afternoon light streaming through the crystal windows seemed to dim as Taya stared at the chessboard, her world contracting to 64 squares that had become her personal battlefield, and her impending Waterloo. What had begun as a cruel joke was morphing into something that felt dangerously close to public execution, with herself as the condemned. Kendrick's last move, a quiet bishop retreat to d6, appeared almost modest to untrained eyes. But Taya could feel its true purpose radiating across the board like heat from a forge. The piece now controlled crucial central squares while supporting a pawn advance that would crack open her position like an eggshell. Every fiber of chess knowledge she possessed screamed warnings she didn't know how to heed. "Surely it's time for refreshments," Margaret Pemberton suggested, her voice pitched higher than usual. The suggestion hung in the air like a life preserver thrown to a drowning woman, but Taya couldn't bring herself to grasp it. To stop now would be an admission of defeat more humiliating than any checkmate. We're not finished yet," Taya managed, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for her queen. The most powerful piece on the board had to have an answer. It had to. She moved the queen to h5, attacking Kendrick's kingside with what she hoped looked like threatening aggression. But even as she released the piece, she could see the move's desperation. It was the chess equivalent of throwing a wild punch while falling backward, all force and fury signifying nothing. Kendrick studied the position for perhaps 3 seconds before his hand moved with the certainty of inevitability. g6. A simple pawn push that not only deflected the queen's attack, but simultaneously opened lines for his own pieces while weakening Taya's kingside structure. It was chess poetry written in the language of pure logic. How does he see these things so quickly? Charlotte Whitmore whispered to Helen, her voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone watching magic she couldn't comprehend. "Robert played chess for 30 years, and I never saw him move with such certainty." The comparison to Taya's late husband hung in the air like an accusation. Robert had been considered the finest chess player in their social circle, a man whose strategic mind had built the Ashworth fortune from railroad investments and real estate speculation. Yet watching Kendrick play was like observing a different species entirely, one that operated on levels of understanding Robert had never approached. Taya's next move, QH4, continued her desperate assault on Kendrick's king position. But the attack felt hollow, like shouting into a void that absorbed every threat and transformed it into something else entirely. She was running out of pieces, running out of time, running out of the illusions that had sustained her superiority complex for 6 decades. Rosa stood frozen by the window, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched her son navigate waters more treacherous than any ocean. Each move he made was brilliant, but brilliance in a black child could be its own form of danger. She'd raised him to be invisible, to survive by making no waves, attracting no attention. Now he was blazing like a comet across the sky of Taya Ashworth's sitting room, and Rosa couldn't decide whether to feel terrified or proud. Kendrick's response to the Queen's repositioning was a masterclass in defensive technique. NF6, developing his remaining knight while simultaneously attacking Taya's queen and defending his king. The move pulsed with multiple purposes, each thread of intention woven together into a tapestry of perfect chess logic. "Your queen needs to move again, Mrs. Ashworth," Kendrick said gently, his voice carrying no trace of mockery despite the devastating accuracy of his observation. "She's being attacked by my knight." The kindness in his tone made it worse somehow. Here was a child, a servant's child, showing her mercy while dismantling her position piece by piece. It was charity of the most crushing kind, generosity that highlighted the gulf between their abilities more starkly than any boast or taunt could have managed. Taya moved her queen to G5, trying to maintain pressure while staying out of immediate danger. But the move felt desperate even to her untrained tactical sense. She was being pushed around the board like a beginner, reacting to threats she barely understood from an opponent who seemed to see the entire game unfolding in his mind like a completed symphony. "This is impossible," Margaret muttered, her carefully modulated social voice cracking slightly. "Children don't play chess like this. Not children who..." She couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what she meant. Not children from their circumstances. Not children who looked like Kendrick. Not children whose mothers cleaned toilets and folded laundry for women like them. But the evidence of their eyes was becoming impossible to deny. With each exchange, Kendrick revealed new layers of understanding that went far beyond memorized patterns or lucky guessing. He was reading the position like scripture, seeing combinations that stretched multiple moves into the future with crystalline clarity. His next move shattered what remained of Taya's defensive hopes. Ing4, bringing the knight to an aggressive square where it attacked multiple weaknesses simultaneously. The piece landed on its new square like a sword thrust to the heart of Taya's position, and suddenly every one of her remaining pieces seemed to tremble under indirect threats. "My knight controls many important squares now," Kendrick explained softly, his dark eyes meeting Taya's with something that might have been compassion. "Would you like me to show you the tactical ideas I'm considering?" The offer was made with such genuine helpfulness that it took everyone a moment to absorb its implications. A 12-year-old was offering chess instruction to a woman who had claimed mastery of the game. The role reversal was so complete, so stunning in its implications, that the room fell into absolute silence. Taya's face cycled through multiple shades of red and white as the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. In front of her closest friends, women who would dissect this moment for years to come, she was being systematically demolished by a child she'd intended to humiliate. The cruel entertainment she'd planned had backfired with spectacular completeness. Desperate now, She moved her king to try to escape the growing net of threats. But the move was illegal, castling through check, and Kendrick caught it immediately. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said quietly, his voice gentle but firm, "you can't castle right now because your king would have to move through a square I'm attacking. Would you like to try a different move?" The correction was delivered with such kindness that it somehow made the humiliation complete. Not only was she losing, not only was she being outplayed by a child, but now she was making illegal moves that revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of the game's basic rules. Margaret gasped audibly. Charlotte pressed her hand to her mouth. Helen simply stared, her composure finally cracking under the weight of witnessing something that challenged every assumption she'd ever made about intelligence, class, and the natural order of the world. Rosa felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched her son navigate this impossible situation with such grace. He was correcting his employer's chess errors with the same respectful attention he might show a library volunteer or chess teacher. In his world, knowledge was knowledge, and ignorance deserved patient correction regardless of who possessed it. Taya made another move, desperately, almost randomly, but everyone could see that the game was essentially over. Kendrick's pieces were coordinated symphonically, while hers struggled against each other in chaotic discord. The position on the board told a story of complete domination that no social conventions could obscure. But beyond the chess, something even more profound was happening. In these precious minutes, a 12-year-old black boy had revealed himself to be intellectually superior to a woman who represented everything his society told him he could never be. And he had done it with such dignity and grace that even his intended tormentor couldn't hate him for it. The room held its breath, suspended between the world they had always known and the one that Kendrick West was quietly, inexorably revealing to them. In a few more moves, the game would be over. But its implications would echo through their lives for years to come. 3 moves later, the inevitable arrived with the quiet finality of a closing door. "Checkmate," Kendrick whispered, his voice barely audible above the grandfather clock's relentless ticking. The word fell into the crystalline silence of Taya Ashworth's sitting room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through every corner of the space. Taya stared at the board, her mind refusing to process what her eyes clearly showed. Her king stood trapped in a cage of Kendrick's construction, surrounded, cornered, with no legal move remaining. The white pieces that had begun the game with such promise now lay scattered and purposeless, overwhelmed by the elegant coordination of their dark counterparts. How?" she stammered, her voice breaking on the words. "This isn't possible." But Kendrick, with the patient grace of a born teacher, began to trace the sequence that had led to her downfall. His small finger moved across the board like a conductor's baton, each gesture revealing another layer of the masterpiece he'd crafted. "Your queen was very strong on G5, he explained, his tone respectful and educational, but she was also very alone. When I played NH5, my knight attacked her and also prepared to go to F4, where it would be really powerful." His finger traced the path. "You had to move your queen to safety, but every square I gave you was part of a bigger plan." Margaret Pemberton leaned forward until her diamond earrings caught the chandelier light, her mouth slightly open as she watched this impossible child explain chess concepts that sounded like a foreign language. What is he saying? Is he actually teaching?" Helen Crawford finished in a whisper. "He's teaching Taya chess." The words hung in the air like an indictment. In their world, instruction flowed downward from those who possessed knowledge, breeding, and position to those who needed elevation. Teachers were credentials and pedigrees, not 12-year-old boys whose mothers scrubbed their toilets. Kendrick continued his gentle dissection, his finger moving to show how each piece had contributed to the final assault. "After you moved your queen to H3, I could play NF4, attacking your queen again while also threatening your king. You moved your queen to G2, but that's when I could play QH4. His hand rested on the black queen that had delivered the killing blow, A piece that had materialized on H4 like an avenging angel, supported by the very knight Taya had tried to chase away. The coordination was breathtaking, each piece working in perfect harmony to create threats Taya had never seen coming. "Your king has no escape squares," Kendrick concluded softly. "My queen controls G1 and H1, my knight covers G2 and E2, and your own pieces block the other squares. It's called a smothered mate pattern, though this one is a little different because—" He trailed off, perhaps sensing that further explanation might be cruel. The damage was already complete. Taya Ashworth, widow of Charleston's most successful railroad magnate, descendant of 3 generations of Southern aristocracy, pillar of local society, had been systematically destroyed at chess by a child she'd invited to the table as a source of amusement. The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte fumbled for her pearls as if they might restore some sense of order to a universe that had suddenly turned upside down. Margaret's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, while Helen simply stared at the board as if it might reorganize itself into something that made sense. But it was Taya's expression that would haunt Rose's dreams for weeks to come. The woman's face cycled through confusion, humiliation, rage, and something that might have been the first stirrings of reluctant respect. Her entire worldview was crumbling in real time, and everyone in the room could see it happening. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The question came out as barely more than a breath, Taya's social composure finally abandoning her completely. And with that simple question, the floodgates of Kendrick's hidden life burst open. 6 months earlier. The memory unfolded like a flower blooming in reverse, carrying Kendrick back to the moment his chess education truly began. He was sitting in the children's section of the Charleston Public Library, surrounded by picture books and the gentle chaos of after-school programs, when he first encountered the wooden chess set tucked forgotten on a bottom shelf. The pieces were simple carved wood, nothing like the ivory and ebony masterpiece before him now, but they had called to him with mysterious authority. He'd arranged them on the board according to the diagrams in a beginner's book, his young mind immediately grasping the elegant logic of the game's structure. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian who ran the youth programs, had found him there 3 hours later, still absorbed in working through basic tactics puzzles. "My goodness," she'd said, settling her considerable frame into the child-sized chair beside him. "You've been at this quite a while, haven't you?" "It's beautiful," Kendrick had replied, his eyes never leaving the board. "Like a puzzle and a story and a song all at the same time." Mrs. Patterson had smiled, the first adult smile directed at him in weeks that hadn't been filtered through pity or condescension. "Would you like me to show you some of the deeper patterns? I used to teach chess before I became a librarian." What followed were 6 months of intensive education disguised as after-school fun. Mrs. Patterson, it turned out, was a former state champion who had given up competitive play to raise her family. But her love for the game burned as brightly as ever, and in Kendrick she found the rarest of pupils, one who absorbed chess knowledge like a sponge and asked for more. They worked through opening principles and tactical combinations, endgame techniques and positional understanding. Kendrick devoured chess books with the same intensity he'd once reserved for fantasy novels, his rating climbing steadily in the online games Mrs. Patterson helped him access on the library computers. "You have a gift," she told him during one of their sessions, watching him solve a puzzle that should have taken an adult 20 minutes in less than 5. "Not just for chess, but for seeing patterns that others miss. Don't ever let anyone convince you that intelligence has anything to do with zip codes or bank accounts." Back in the present. "The library," Kendrick said simply, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of Taya's sitting room. "Mrs. Patterson at the Charleston Public Library taught me. She used to be a chess champion." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. A public library. A retired librarian. The most democratic institutions imaginable had produced this impossible child who sat before them with the quiet confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt his own mind. A librarian? Margaret's voice cracked slightly on the word, as if the concept of learning from someone without a trust fund was too radical to process. She says I have potential, Kendrick continued, his young voice carrying a dignity that shamed every adult in the room. She says chess doesn't care where you come from, only how clearly you can think. The words landed like hammer blows against the carefully constructed walls of their prejudices. Here was a child speaking truths they'd spent lifetimes avoiding, armed with nothing but a keen mind and access to books they'd never thought to value. Taya looked down at the board one final time, seeing her defeated king surrounded by Kendrick's forces. But for the first time, she also saw something else, the elegant beauty of the position he'd created, the artistic grace with which he'd woven his pieces together into an instrument of perfect destruction. You played beautifully, she heard herself say, the words emerging from some part of her soul she'd thought had died with Robert. I've never seen chess played like that. Have you ever had a moment where someone completely shattered your assumptions about what they were capable of? Drop a comment below. Kendrick smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd shown since entering this room of crystal and judgment. It transformed his face completely, revealing the child beneath the chess master, the boy who still marveled at the game's infinite possibilities. Thank you, Mrs. Ashworth, he said simply. That means a lot coming from you. But even as the words left his lips, Rosa was already moving toward her son, her protective instincts overriding everything else. She'd seen what happened to black children who revealed themselves to be exceptional in front of white audiences. Sometimes the recognition was worse than the invisibility. The game was over, but everyone in the room understood that something much larger was just beginning. In Checkmate, Kendrick West had revealed himself to be not just brilliant, but dangerously so. And in a world where brilliance in his skin was often seen as threat rather than gift, that revelation carried consequences none of them were prepared to face. Taya stared at the board where her king lay conquered, and for the first time in her life, wondered if everything she'd believed about worth and intelligence and the natural order of things might be nothing more than elaborate lies she'd told herself to justify a system that served her comfort at others' expense. The truth was laid out before her in 32 pieces of carved wood and ivory, as clear and undeniable as mathematics itself. The exodus began within minutes of the final checkmate, a carefully choreographed retreat disguised as polite necessity. Margaret suddenly remembered a pressing engagement with her decorator. Charlotte discovered an urgent need to check on her granddaughter's piano recital preparations. Helen simply gathered her purse and headed for the door with the purposeful stride of someone fleeing a crime scene. Their goodbyes were strained, filled with the awkward pauses that followed experiences none of them knew how to process. What did one say after witnessing the complete demolition of their social order by a 12-year-old with a library card? Taya, darling, Margaret managed as she paused at the front door, her voice pitched higher than usual. Such an interesting afternoon. We must do this again soon. But even as she spoke the words, they all knew there would be no again. Not after what they'd witnessed. Some revelations were too profound to simply absorb and move past. The bridge club that had sustained their friendship for 2 decades had just witnessed something that would hang over every future gathering like an unspoken question mark. Taya stood in the doorway, watching her friends, if they could still be called that, make their hasty escapes. Their heels clicked against her marble steps with staccato urgency, each woman eager to reach the safety of her own car, her own house, her own version of reality where 12-year-old prodigies didn't emerge from servants' quarters to shatter fundamental assumptions about intelligence and worth. When the last car pulled away from her circular drive, Taya closed the door and leaned against it, feeling suddenly exhausted. The house seemed different now, larger somehow, yet more confining. The crystal chandelier that had impressed visitors for decades now felt like a gaudy monument to her own ignorance. She found them in the sitting room, mother and son working together to restore order to the space that had hosted such an extraordinary disorder. Rosa was carefully replacing the chess pieces in their felt-lined box while Kendrick straightened the magazines on the coffee table, their movements synchronized by years of shared work. But something had changed. The boy who had entered this room as invisible help was now undeniably present in a way that made the air itself feel charged with possibility and danger. Taya could no longer look at him without seeing the brilliant mind that had just dismantled her so completely, so gracefully. "Leave that," she heard herself say, her voice softer than it had been in years. "Please. Both of you just sit down for a moment." Rosa's hand stilled on the chess box, her dark eyes searching Taya's face for signs of the storm she was certain would follow. In her experience, white employers who suffered public humiliation rarely responded with philosophical acceptance. But something in Taya's expression, a vulnerability Rosa had never seen before, made her lower the box and settle uncertainly onto the edge of the sofa. Kendrick remained standing, his young body poised for flight despite his earlier display of confidence. The chess game was over, but he understood instinctively that a different kind of contest was about to begin, one where the rules were less clear and the stakes potentially much higher. "How old are you, Kendrick?" Taya asked, settling into the chair across from them. Without her friends as audience, without the performance of superiority to maintain, her voice carried a quality neither Rosa nor her son had heard before, genuine curiosity. 12, ma'am," Kendrick replied, his formal politeness intact despite everything that had transpired. 12, Taya repeated, as if testing the word's weight. "When I was 12, I was worried about hair ribbons and whether Jimmy Morrison might notice me at the church social." She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on her silk dress. "What do you think about, Kendrick? When you're not studying chess, what occupies your mind?" The question seemed to surprise him. Adults in his world rarely asked children about their thoughts, especially adults like Taya Ashworth. He glanced at his mother, seeking guidance, but Rosa's expression offered no help. She was navigating uncharted waters herself. "I think about patterns," Kendrick said finally, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to the subject. "Not just in chess, but everywhere. Like how the shadows move across the courtyard outside follow mathematical curves, or how the way people talk tells you things about how they think." He paused, then added with touching honesty, "I think about college sometimes. What it might be like to sit in a classroom where everyone wants to learn." The words hit Taya with unexpected force. Here was a child who dreamed of education with the same intensity other children reserved for toy stores or amusement parks. A boy who saw mathematical beauty in shadows and found human psychology revealed in speech patterns. "What would you study?" she found herself asking. "If you could study anything?" Kendrick's eyes lit up with the first truly unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "Everything," he said with breathless enthusiasm. "Mathematics and philosophy and literature and history. I want to understand how things work, not just chess pieces, but ideas. How people discover things, how knowledge builds on itself across centuries." Rosa watched her son reveal himself to this woman who had treated him as entertainment, her heart swelling with pride and terror in equal measure. This was her brilliant boy, the child who checked out university-level books from the library and read them with the intensity of a scholar, who asked questions that made her wish she'd had more education to offer him. "Your mother works very hard," Taya said, turning her attention to Rosa for the first time as a person rather than a function. "How many jobs do you have?" The directness of the question startled Rosa. 3, ma'am, she replied carefully. "I clean here 2 days a week, work at the hotel downtown on weekends, and do evening cleaning at the law offices on Barrett Street." 3 jobs, Taya repeated, the mathematics of Rosa's life suddenly visible to her in stark clarity. A woman working 3 jobs to support herself and a gifted son, scraping together enough for library fines and internet access at the community center, nurturing genius on a budget that wouldn't cover Taya's weekly flower arrangements. It must be difficult, Taya said, and for the first time in years, she meant the words without calculation or social performance. Raising a son like Kendrick, wanting to give him opportunities, it must keep you awake at night. Rosa's composure cracked slightly at the unexpected empathy. Every night, she admitted. He's so smart, Mrs. Ashworth. So much smarter than anyone knows. But smart doesn't matter if you can't afford to develop it properly. The conversation fell into a contemplative silence, each woman absorbed in thoughts that would have been impossible just hours earlier. Taya found herself imagining Rosa's life, the early mornings, the careful budgeting, the constant worry about a son whose gifts might be wasted for lack of resources. "Tell me about Mrs. Patterson," Taya said to Kendrick. "The librarian who taught you chess." Kendrick's face brightened immediately. "She's wonderful. She says talent is like a seed. It needs the right conditions to grow, but the seed itself doesn't care about the soil's zip code." He paused, then added with touching reverence, "She was a state champion when she was younger, but she gave it up to teach children. She says sharing knowledge is more important than keeping trophies." The philosophy embedded in those simple words struck Taya like a revelation. Here was a woman who had achieved excellence and chosen to pour it into others, rather than hoarding it for personal glory. The contrast with Taya's own life, spent accumulating status symbols and social position while contributing little of real value to the world, was almost painful to contemplate. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Taya said softly. "You're fortunate to have found her." "I know," Kendrick replied with the earnestness that only children could manage. "She says I might be good enough to compete in tournaments someday, if I can find the right support. She's been teaching me for free, but tournament entry fees and travel costs." He trailed off, perhaps realizing he was venturing into territory that might sound like asking for charity. But Taya heard what he hadn't said, saw the careful way Rosa's hand stilled when her son mentioned tournament costs. Here was a family navigating between extraordinary potential and practical limitations, genius constrained by economics rather than capability. "You could have humiliated me much more thoroughly today," Taya observed, her voice carrying a quality of wonder. "You could have made me look foolish in front of my friends, taking revenge for the way I treated you. Why didn't you?" Kendrick considered the question with the same seriousness he'd brought to the chess game. "Because chess isn't about making people feel bad," he said finally. "It's about finding the truth of the position. The truth was that I could play better than you, but that doesn't make me better than you as a person. Mrs. Patterson taught me that winning with grace is just as important as the winning itself." The wisdom in those words, spoken by a child who had every reason for resentment, left Taya momentarily speechless. Here was a lesson in character that her 62 years and privileged education had never provided. A 12-year-old boy was teaching her about dignity, about the difference between capability and worth, about the kind of grace that elevated everyone it touched. For the first time since Robert's death, Taya felt something stirring in her chest that might have been respect, not for social position or accumulated wealth, but for the quiet nobility she was witnessing in this small sitting room. A mother's love channeled into sacrifice. A child's brilliance tempered with humility. A librarian's generosity multiplied through careful teaching. "I owe you both an apology," Taya said, the words emerging from a deeper place than social convention. "What I did today was cruel and wrong. You deserved better than to be used as entertainment." Rosa's eyes widened at the unexpected acknowledgement, while Kendrick simply nodded with a grave acceptance of someone who had learned early that adults often acted poorly but occasionally grew wise enough to admit it. In the gentle afternoon light filtering through crystal windows, three people sat in a room where the fundamental assumptions about worth and intelligence had been quietly, permanently rearranged. And for the first time in years, Taya Ashworth began to suspect that the most valuable lessons weren't found in her social circle at all, but in the quiet dignity of people she'd never bothered to truly see. 3 days passed in a kind of suspended animation, each one stretching like taffy in the humid Charleston heat. Taya moved through her empty mansion like a ghost haunting her own life, unable to settle into the comfortable routines that had sustained her for years. The bridge table remained folded against the wall, its silence a constant reminder of the afternoon that had shattered her world with 32 pieces of carved wood and ivory. She dismissed Rosa for the week, officially to give herself time to reorganize the household schedule, but actually because she couldn't bear to look at the woman without feeling the weight of decades of casual cruelty pressing against her conscience. Every pristine surface in the house seemed to mock her now, each crystal glass and polished mirror a testament to work she'd never acknowledged, sacrifice she'd never recognized. But it was the computer in Robert's old study that finally broke her resolve. Taya had avoided the room since her husband's death 3 years earlier, preserving it like a shrine to their shared life. His chess books still lined the mahogany shelves, their leather spines creating a wall of knowledge he'd accumulated over decades of passionate study. She'd always felt intimidated by those volumes, sensing depths of understanding she could never reach. Now she understood why. Compared to what she'd witnessed in her sitting room, Robert's chess collection represented the earnest efforts of a talented amateur. Impressive to her circle, perhaps, but fundamentally different from the profound mastery she'd seen flowing through Kendrick's young mind like electricity through wire. The computer sat on Robert's desk like a judgment, its screen dark but somehow expectant. Taya had resisted technology for years, preferring the familiar rhythms of telephone calls and handwritten notes. But curiosity, and something deeper, something that felt like penance, finally drove her to press the power button. The machine hummed to life with digital efficiency, and after 20 minutes of frustrated struggle with passwords and search engines, she finally managed to navigate to the United States Chess Federation website. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed Kendrick West into the player search function. The results appeared instantly, stark black text on white background that hit her consciousness like a physical blow. Kendrick West, age 12, Charleston, South Carolina. Current rating, 2247 rank, 43rd in National Youth Under 13 Division Tournament results. First place Carolina Youth Open, second place Southeast Regional Scholastic Championship, first place Charleston City Junior Championship. The numbers swam before her eyes as their implications crashed over her in waves. A rating of 2,247 placed Kendrick firmly in expert territory, a level that most adult chess players never achieved despite decades of study. At 12 years old, he was already stronger than 99% of tournament players in the country. But it was the tournament results that truly devastated her. First place finishes. Regional championships. This wasn't a talented child playing in local school competitions. This was a nationally ranked prodigy competing at the highest levels of youth chess and winning consistently. She clicked through to his individual game records, finding notation that read like poetry written in an alien language. The moves flowed with the same inexorable logic she'd experienced across her sitting room table, each game telling a story of superior understanding systematically overwhelming lesser opposition. "Dear God," she whispered to the empty study, her voice barely audible above the computer's gentle humming. "What have I done?" The question echoed in the silence, unanswered and unanswerable. She'd treated a nationally ranked chess prodigy like a performing monkey for the amusement of her social circle. She'd invited a boy whose talent was recognized across the Southeast to entertain her friends with his supposed inadequacy. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, but what made it worse was the realization that Kendrick had known exactly what she was doing. He'd understood from the moment she'd approached him in the kitchen that he was being set up for humiliation. Yet he'd accepted the challenge with quiet dignity, played with restraint and grace, and even offered to teach her when the massacre was complete. Taya pushed back from the desk, her silk dress rustling in the studious silence. The chess books seemed to regard her with accusatory intensity, their leather spines forming a jury of knowledge she'd never possessed. She pulled one down at random, a thick volume on endgame theory that had been Robert's favorite, and let it fall open in her hands. The pages were filled with diagrams and analysis that might as well have been hieroglyphics. What she'd always assumed was her husband's expertise now revealed itself as competent dilettanteism. The gulf between Robert's understanding and what she'd witnessed from Kendrick was vast as the ocean separating continents. The doorbell's chime cut through her anguished reverie like a blade. For a moment she considered ignoring it, remaining hidden in Robert's study with her shame and newfound understanding. But training won over inclination, and she found herself walking toward the front door with mechanical precision. Rosa stood on the marble steps, her usually composed features etched with an emotion Taya had never seen before, not anger exactly, but something deeper and more dangerous. The woman who had cleaned her house for 8 years without complaint was holding herself with the rigid dignity of someone who had finally reached the end of her patience. "Mrs. Ashworth," Rosa said, her voice carrying a formality that somehow felt more threatening than shouting would have been. "I need to speak with you about my son." They settled in the kitchen, neutral ground, neither the scene of Kendrick's triumph nor the preserve of Taya's domestic authority. Rosa declined the offer of tea or coffee, remaining standing while Taya perched uncertainly on the edge of a breakfast chair. "I've been thinking about what happened the other day," Rosa began, her words carefully measured but carrying undertones of volcanic force. "About what you did to Kendrick, and what it means for our family going forward." The conversation Taya had been dreading was finally beginning, and she found herself without adequate defenses. All her social armor, the gracious deflection, the subtle intimidation, the casual assumption of superiority, felt suddenly useless against the quiet intensity of Rosa's righteous anger. "I know you're probably upset," Taya began, but Rosa cut her off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "Upset?" Rosa's voice remained controlled, but something dangerous flickered behind her dark eyes. "Mrs. Ashworth, you used my child as entertainment. You invited him to play chess knowing he would lose, planning to humiliate him in front of your friends for your amusement. You turned my brilliant, beautiful boy into a circus act." Each word landed like a hammer blow, driving nails into the coffin of any rationalization Taya might have constructed. There was no defense because the accusation was absolutely, devastatingly accurate. "You don't understand," Rosa continued, her voice gaining strength as years of suppressed emotion finally found voice. "Kendrick is special. Not just smart, special. He sees the world differently than other children, understands things that grown adults struggle with. But he's also black and poor, and living in a world that doesn't want to admit that genius can come from places like us." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond chess games and social embarrassment. Rosa was talking about survival in a system designed to overlook or suppress excellence that emerged from unexpected places. "Every day, I teach him to be invisible," Rosa said, her voice beginning to crack with the weight of maternal protection. "I tell him to work twice as hard for half the recognition. I warn him that being exceptional while black is dangerous, because some people see it as a threat rather than a gift. And then you made him visible in the worst possible way." Taya felt something crumbling inside her chest, not just her social position or wounded pride, but something deeper. The comfortable mythology she'd constructed around her own worth, the careful edifice of superiority she'd built to justify her privilege, was collapsing under the weight of Rosa's truth. "I searched online," Rosa continued relentlessly. "I know you must have seen his rating, his tournament results. You know now what I've always known, that my son is a prodigy, a genuine chess talent who could compete at the highest levels if given proper support. But instead of recognizing his gift, you tried to use it as a weapon against him." The accusation was all the more devastating because it was delivered without hysteria or melodrama. Rosa's pain was controlled, channeled into words that cut with surgical precision. She wasn't just angry about what had happened, She was mourning what it represented about the world her son had to navigate. "I've worked for families like yours for 15 years, Rosa said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've cleaned houses and raised children and pretended not to see the casual cruelty that passes for entertainment in your circles. But I won't let you use my son's brilliance as fuel for your social games." Silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of truths too large for comfortable consumption. Taya sat frozen in her breakfast chair, feeling the full magnitude of her actions settling around her like lead blankets. She'd wounded not just Kendrick, but the woman who had sacrificed everything to nurture his extraordinary gifts. "I'm resigning," Rosa said finally, her words delivered with quiet finality. "I can't work for someone who sees my child as entertainment rather than a human being with feelings and dignity. We'll finish out this week, but then we're done." The practical implications hit Taya almost as hard as the moral ones. Rosa's departure would mean more than losing excellent domestic help. It would mean losing any chance to make amends, any opportunity to prove that people could change, grow, transcend their worst impulses. "Rosa, please," Taya found her voice at last, though it emerged cracked and uncertain. "I know I was wrong. I know what I did was inexcusable. But please don't let my stupidity cost Kendrick opportunities he deserves." Rosa's laugh was bitter and knowing. "Opportunities? Mrs. Ashworth, you're not the source of opportunities for people like us. You're the obstacle we have to overcome to find them ourselves." The words struck like a physical blow, not because they were delivered with malice, but because they carried the weight of absolute truth. Taya had never been a benefactor or patron. She'd been part of the system that made brilliance like Kendrick's harder to develop and recognize. "I could help," Taya said desperately, though even as the words left her mouth she heard their inadequacy. "Tournament fees, travel costs, proper coaching." "Help." Rosa's voice carried a lifetime of skepticism about white charity. "Mrs. Ashworth, 3 days ago you didn't know my son's name. You certainly didn't know he was a chess prodigy. What changed? Did his intelligence become more valuable once you realized other people already recognized it?" The question penetrated to the heart of Taya's transformation, exposing the uncomfortable truth that her newfound respect was based on external validation rather than inherent recognition of Kendrick's worth. She'd needed websites and ratings to see what should have been apparent from the moment he'd played the Sicilian defense with such fluid confidence. "I was wrong," Taya said again, the words feeling increasingly hollow even as she meant them with growing sincerity. "I was prejudiced and cruel and blind. But I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to be better." Rosa studied her employer's face for a long moment, searching for signs of genuine transformation beneath layers of privilege and social conditioning. What she found there wasn't sufficient to rebuild trust, but it was perhaps enough to prevent complete rupture. "You want to be better?" Rosa asked, her voice still guarded but carrying a note that might have been hope. "Then understand this. My son's worth doesn't depend on chess ratings or tournament victories. He was brilliant and deserving of respect before you knew he could play chess, and he would remain so even if he never touched another piece. Intelligence isn't a performance for your entertainment. It's a gift that deserves nurturing regardless of who possesses it." The lecture was delivered with the authority of someone who had spent years protecting and developing exceptional talent in a world designed to overlook it. Rosa wasn't just defending Kendrick. She was educating Taya about fundamental principles of human dignity that should have been obvious but somehow weren't. "Can you forgive me?" Taya asked, the question emerging from a place deeper than social convention. "Not excuse what I did, but forgive it enough to let me try to make amends?" Rosa was quiet for a long time, her dark eyes studying Taya's face with the intensity of someone trying to peer into another person's soul. Finally, she spoke with careful precision. "Forgiveness isn't the issue, Mrs. Ashworth. The question is whether you've learned enough to be trusted around my son's future." And honestly, I'm not sure either of us knows the answer to that yet. The conditional nature of Rose's response left the door open while acknowledging the vast distance that remained to be traveled. Trust, once shattered by cruel entertainment, would not be easily rebuilt. But perhaps, it wasn't entirely impossible. As Rosa gathered her purse and headed toward the door, Taya sat alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the gleaming surfaces that had once represented accomplishment but now felt like monuments to emptiness. The weight of genuine reckoning settled around her like a familiar coat, heavy but somehow necessary. For the first time in her adult life, Taya Ashworth faced the uncomfortable truth that she had work to do, not on her house or her social position, but on the fundamental assumptions that had guided her existence. The question was whether she possessed the courage to undertake that reconstruction, and whether it was already too late to matter. The Charleston Public Library felt like hallowed ground as Taya pushed through its heavy glass doors, her designer heels clicking against worn linoleum with uncertain rhythm. She'd driven past this building thousands of times over the years, never once considering it worthy of her attention. Libraries were for people who couldn't afford to buy books, places where the less fortunate gathered to access resources that others took for granted. Now, walking through corridors lined with democratic knowledge accessible to anyone with a library card, she felt the full weight of her ignorance pressing against her chest like a physical force. The children's section buzzed with quiet activity, homework help sessions, reading circles, parents settling restless toddlers into picture book corners. And there, at a table surrounded by chess books and score sheets, she found the woman who had helped create the miracle she'd witnessed in her sitting room. Mrs. Patterson was everything Taya hadn't expected. 70-ish, with steel-gray hair and reading glasses that had seen better decades, wearing a cardigan that suggested comfort over fashion. She looked like someone's grandmother, not the former state chess champion who had recognized and nurtured genius in a 12-year-old boy. Mrs. Patterson? Taya approached the table with uncharacteristic hesitancy. I'm Taya Ashworth. I believe you know you've been teaching Kendrick West chess. The librarian's eyes sharpened with immediate understanding, taking in Taya's expensive clothing and careful bearing with a kind of assessment that missed nothing. Ah, Mrs. Patterson said simply, her voice carrying decades of experience reading people as well as books. You're the employer. The one who invited Kendrick to play chess for entertainment. There was no accusation in the words, but their simple accuracy made Taya wince as if she'd been slapped. News of the incident had obviously reached the woman who'd invested months of unpaid time in Kendrick's development. I need to understand, Taya said, settling into the child-sized chair across from Mrs. Patterson with awkward dignity. How talented is he? Really? Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment, weighing how much truth this privileged woman could handle. Kendrick West, she said finally, is the most naturally gifted chess player I've encountered in 40 years of teaching the game. His pattern recognition is exceptional, his calculation ability is remarkable, and his intuitive understanding of position is simply extraordinary. She paused, letting the weight of that assessment settle before continuing. But more importantly, he's a good person. He helps younger children with their homework, treats everyone with respect regardless of their circumstances, and approaches learning with a humility that puts most adults to shame. His character is even more impressive than his chess ability. The description painted a picture of exceptional talent paired with exceptional character, a combination that made Taya's treatment of him even more inexcusable. She'd tried to humiliate someone who embodied virtues she'd spent a lifetime claiming to value. How far could he go? Taya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. With proper support, proper coaching, how far? Mrs. Patterson's expression grew serious. With the right resources? National Master by 15. International Master by 18. Possibly even Grandmaster status, though that depends on factors beyond raw talent. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to emphasize the gravity of her next words. Mrs. Ashworth, you witnessed something rare the other day. Kendrick plays chess the way Mozart played piano, not just with learned skill, but with innate understanding that can't be taught. The comparison hit Taya like revelation. Mozart. Genius so pure it transcended conventional categories of achievement. And she tried to make that genius dance for her amusement like a trained bear in a traveling circus. What does he need? The question emerged from somewhere deeper than social obligation, somewhere that felt almost spiritual in its urgency. To reach his potential, what would that require? Mrs. Patterson pulled out a notebook filled with careful calculations. Proper coaching would cost about $3,000 a month. Tournament travel and entry fees would add another $2,000 monthly during competition season. Chess software, books, analysis tools, maybe $500 monthly for materials. She looked up from her figures. It's not just about money, though. He needs access to stronger players, invitation to elite training camps, exposure to international competition. The numbers swirled in Taya's mind like autumn leaves in a windstorm. $60,000 annually, pocket change compared to her husband's estate, but representing a massive commitment that would fundamentally alter her relationship with the West family. And without that support? Taya asked, though she dreaded the answer. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew sad. He'll continue improving through library resources and online play. He might even make expert level on his own. But gifts like his require cultivation to reach their full potential. Without proper nurturing, even the most brilliant talents can wither from lack of opportunity. The image of Kendrick's genius withering for lack of resources was almost physically painful to contemplate. Taya imagined him years in the future, still brilliant but trapped by circumstances beyond his control, his extraordinary mind never fully realized because the right doors had never opened. There's something else, Mrs. Patterson added gently. Kendrick's been asking about you since your chess game. Not with resentment, with curiosity. He wants to understand why you invited him to play, what you were hoping would happen. He's trying to solve you like a chess problem. The revelation was perhaps the most humbling yet. Instead of harboring justified anger about his treatment, Kendrick was approaching her cruelty as an intellectual puzzle to be understood. His response to prejudice was not hatred but analysis, the mark of a mind that sought understanding even in the face of injury. Taya left the library with Mrs. Patterson's calculations burning in her purse and a decision crystallizing in her mind with terrifying clarity. She drove through Charleston's historic district, past the mansions and gardens that had always represented security and belonging, seeing them now as monuments to a kind of willful blindness she could no longer afford to maintain. That evening, alone in Robert's study with his chess books bearing silent witness, she made the phone call that would change everything. Rosa. Her voice trembled slightly as she waited for the woman to respond. I know you've resigned, but I need to ask you something. Something important. The pause on the other end felt infinite, charged with all the history between them, years of casual dismissal, the recent cruelty, the reckoning that had followed. I'm listening, Rosa said finally, her voice carefully neutral. I want to sponsor Kendrick's chess education, Taya said, the words rushing out before her courage could fail. Coaching, tournaments, everything he needs to reach his potential. No strings attached, no control over decisions, no publicity or recognition for me. Just letting him be as brilliant as he already is. The silence stretched so long that Taya wondered if the connection had been lost. When Rosa finally spoke, her voice carried an emotion too complex for easy categorization. Why? The single word contained multitudes, suspicion and hope, protectiveness and possibility all wrapped together in 2 syllables. Because, Taya said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the truth she discovered in 3 days of agonizing self-examination. Talent like his doesn't come along often. And when it does, people like me have a choice. We can either recognize it and help it flourish, or we can let our prejudices destroy something beautiful and irreplaceable. She paused, staring at Robert's chess books as she found words for feelings she'd never had to articulate before. I've spent my whole life believing that worth was determined by bloodlines and bank accounts. Your son taught me that I was wrong about everything that matters. The least I can do is make sure his brilliance has the chance to shine as brightly as it deserves. The offer hung between them across phone lines and social chasms, carrying the weight of potential redemption and the promise of radical change. Taya had made her choice, not just about sponsoring Kendrick's chess education, but about what kind of person she wanted to be in whatever years remained to her. Now she could only wait to see if Rosa, and more importantly if Kendrick, would give her the chance to prove that people could change, that prejudice could transform into respect, and that the cruelest beginnings could sometimes lead to the most beautiful endings. 6 months later, the convention center in Atlanta hummed with a concentrated energy of 300 young chess minds, all focused on the 64 squares that would determine the National Junior Championship. Tournament boards stretched across the cavernous space in perfect rows, each one hosting its own drama of calculation and courage. Taya Ashworth sat in the spectator section, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched Kendrick West navigate the final round of the most important tournament of his young life. Gone were the designer dresses and statement jewelry. Today she wore simple slacks and a modest blouse, her transformation as complete as it was unexpected. Beside her, Rosa leaned forward with the intense focus of a mother whose dreams were playing out in real time. 6 months of proper coaching had refined Kendrick's natural gifts into something approaching artistry. His rating had climbed to 2,350, placing him among the top 20 players in his age group nationally. But more than the numbers, it was the change in his bearing that marked his transformation. The invisible boy who had once hidden in servants' quarters now carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his worth wasn't dependent on others' recognition. His shoulders were straight, his movements purposeful, his presence undeniable. He's beautiful when he plays, isn't he? Taya whispered, her voice filled with the kind of wonder usually reserved for sunsets or symphonies. Rosa nodded, too emotional to trust her voice. Watching her son compete at this level, surrounded by children from chess families with generations of tournament tradition, holding his own through pure talent and determination, felt like witnessing a miracle she'd never dared to dream possible. On the board, Kendrick was facing Jonathan Mitchell, a prodigy from an elite chess academy in New York whose family had invested 6 figures in his development. The position was complex, balanced on the knife's edge between equality and advantage, requiring the kind of deep calculation that separated masters from merely strong players. Kendrick studied the position with the same intense focus Taya had first witnessed in her sitting room, but now she understood what she was seeing. This wasn't a child pretending to adult understanding. This was a genuine chess artist creating beauty through logic, crafting victories through pure understanding of the game's infinite complexities. His move came with fluid certainty, Rex 5. A rook sacrifice that opened lines for a devastating attack, the kind of tactical blow that would have made masters nod in appreciation. Across the board, Jonathan's eyes widened as he absorbed the implications of what he was facing. "That's my boy," Rosa breathed, her voice thick with pride and tears. "That's my brilliant, beautiful boy." Taya reached over and squeezed Rosa's hand, a gesture that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, when the distance between employer and employee had seemed as vast as the space between stars. Now they sat together as equals, united in their shared investment in Kendrick's future. The friendship that had grown between them over the past months had surprised everyone, perhaps none more than themselves. What had begun as a chess sponsorship had evolved into something much deeper, a genuine bond forged through shared recognition of Kendrick's extraordinary gifts and shared commitment to nurturing them properly. Taya had discovered that Rosa possessed depths of wisdom and strength that made her own previous social circle seem shallow by comparison. Rosa, in turn, had found in Taya a genuinely reformed ally whose transformation from cruel entertainment seeker to passionate advocate had been as remarkable as any chess combination. But it was Kendrick who had truly transformed them both. His grace under pressure, his ability to forgive without bitterness, his dedication to excellence paired with humility, these qualities had become the lens through which both women now viewed the world. 20 minutes later, Jonathan Mitchell extended his hand in resignation. The game was over, and Kendrick West, the invisible boy from the servants' quarters, had just clinched his first national championship title. The explosion of joy in the spectator section was immediate and overwhelming. Rosa leaped to her feet, tears streaming down her face as she applauded her son's triumph. Taya joined her, clapping until her hands hurt, feeling a pride so fierce it surprised her with its intensity. They rushed to the tournament area where Kendrick was accepting congratulations from officials and fellow competitors. When he saw them approaching, his face broke into the radiant smile that had become Taya's favorite sight in the world. "We did it," he said, wrapping his mother in a hug that lifted her off the ground despite his still small frame. "Mama, we actually did it." Then, to Taya's surprise and profound emotional gratification, he turned to her with arms extended. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of months of transformation, his own and hers, "for believing I was worth investing in." The hug that followed was awkward in its logistics, a 12-year-old embracing a woman who had once seen him as entertainment, but perfect in its emotional authenticity. Taya felt something break open in her chest, some final wall between her old self and the person she was becoming. Later that evening, in the quiet of Kendrick's hotel room, Taya had insisted on covering all tournament expenses, including private accommodations for the family. They set up the traveling chess set that had become a symbol of their unlikely bond. "One more game?" Kendrick asked, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "For old time's sake." But this game was different from their first encounter in every way that mattered. Where once there had been cruelty and intended humiliation, now there was mutual respect and genuine affection. Where once Taya had played to prove superiority, now she played simply for the joy of watching Kendrick's mind work its mathematical magic. The moves flowed with easy conversation, Kendrick explaining his reasoning while Taya absorbed lessons that went far beyond chess strategy. He was teaching her not just about the game, but about approaching challenges with patience, seeing patterns in chaos, finding beauty in logic. "You know," Kendrick said as he castled kingside with characteristic fluidity, "I used to think chess was just about winning. But Mrs. Patterson taught me it's really about understanding. And you taught me something even more important." "What's that?" Taya asked, moving her knight with growing confidence. "That people can change," Kendrick said simply. "That someone can start out seeing you one way and end up seeing you completely differently. That's the most beautiful pattern of all, when hearts change along with minds." The wisdom in those words, spoken by a child who had every reason for bitterness but chose grace instead, left Taya momentarily speechless. She looked across the board at this remarkable young man who had transformed her life as completely as she had transformed his, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine happiness. The game continued in comfortable rhythm, punctuated by Rosa's gentle presence as she alternated between watching the chess and working on the laptop Taya had bought her to help manage Kendrick's tournament schedule. The three of them had become an unlikely family, bound together by shared commitment to nurturing exceptional potential wherever it might emerge. As the clock approached midnight, Kendrick delivered a final gentle checkmate, not with the devastating precision of their first encounter, but with the playful affection of someone teaching a beloved family member. Taya's king fell with dignity this time, surrounded not by conquest but by care. "Checkmate," Kendrick announced with a grin, but immediately began resetting the pieces. Want to play again? I can show you a different opening this time. Taya laughed, a sound that had become more frequent over the past months, bubbling up from places in her heart she'd thought had gone dry years earlier. Always the teacher, she said with deep affection. Yes, let's play again. We have all night. Outside the hotel windows, Atlanta sparkled with urban energy, but inside their small room, three people who had found each other across impossible odds settled in for an evening of chess and conversation. The moves they made on the board mattered less than the bonds they strengthened with each exchange, the family they'd chosen to create from the broken pieces of their first encounter. Rosa watched her son explain tactical concepts to the woman who had once tried to humiliate him, marveling at the mysterious alchemy that had transformed cruelty into love. Taya absorbed lessons in chess and character from the boy who had become the grandson she'd never had, wondering how she'd lived so many years without understanding what truly mattered. And Kendrick, brilliant, gracious Kendrick, moved pieces across the board with the same fluid confidence he'd shown in Taya's sitting room 6 months earlier. But now he played not to prove his worth but to share his joy, not to overcome prejudice but to celebrate the connections that made all victories meaningful. The game began again, as all the best stories do, with possibility, with hope, and with a quiet understanding that some endings are really just the beginning of something even more beautiful than what came before. In the gentle light of a hotel room in Atlanta, love had indeed been found in the most unexpected place, across 64 squares that had once divided but now united, creating bonds that would last not just for the duration of a chess game, but for all the games, and all the years, still to come. Checkmate to loneliness. Victory to love. The most beautiful pattern of all.